In the quiet halls of Madrid's Prado Museum, beneath the hum of reverent tourists and echoing footsteps, there hangs a portrait that glows as though lit from within. Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas, one of the world's most enigmatic masterpieces, arrests every gaze that meets it. But at its center stands not the famed artist nor the shadowed royals reflected in the mirror behind him, but a small girl with golden hair, dressed in layers of brocade and silk, her wide eyes fixed directly on us. She is Margarita Teresa of Spain, 5 years old, the most precious child in all of 17th century Europe. Her face is illuminated with an almost divine light, the kind that painters of the era reserved only for saints. Yet that brightness conceals a truth darker than any shadow Velázquez could paint. Behind those soft curls and innocent eyes lay a fate sealed before her first breath, a destiny shaped by the iron will of a family that considered purity holier than life itself. Margarita Teresa was born into the House of Habsburg, a dynasty that once ruled the world, but was slowly strangling itself with its own blood. Her father, King Philip IV of Spain, was a man worn by defeats, battles lost, provinces slipping away, an empire in decay. Yet to his people he was still the earthly image of divine order, chosen by God to rule. Her mother, Mariana of Austria, was barely more than a girl when she married him. She was his niece, the daughter of his sister. Their marriage was not a scandal, it was policy. For generations, the Habsburgs had married one another to keep their blood pure. The logic was simple and insane. If royal blood was sacred, then it must never be mixed with that of ordinary mortals. The result was a family tree that folded back on itself like an Ouroboros, a serpent devouring its own tail. Uncles wed nieces, cousins wed cousins, until their faces and bodies began to bear the marks of a fatal inheritance. The famous Habsburg jaw, that grotesque protruding chin, became the dynasty's symbol, a deformity mistaken for nobility. And into this world of gilded decay, Margarita Teresa was born on the 12th of July, 1651, inside Madrid's Royal Alcazar Palace. Her birth was greeted with fanfare, not for love, but for what she represented, a new pawn on the chessboard of Europe. Bells rang, priests sang hymns, cannons fired in celebration, but in the royal nursery, the child herself slept beneath frescoed ceilings painted with scenes of divine kingship, while courtiers whispered of dowries and alliances. She was not a daughter, she was a diplomatic investment. As she grew, the little infanta became the glowing centerpiece of the Spanish court. Her nurses dressed her in stiff lace collars and gold-threaded gowns that weighed almost as much as she did. She walked through corridors lined with mirrors and saints, never alone, never unobserved. At her lessons, she was taught not curiosity, but composure, how to bow at the right angle, how to stand motionless for hours, how to smile when kings entered the room. Her toys were miniatures of crowns and scepters, reminders that she was born to serve a destiny, not to choose one. The Spanish court in her childhood was a magnificent theater of control. Every gesture, every meal, every word was dictated by ceremonial law. Servants bowed 3 times before addressing her. Even her laughter, bright and fleeting, was measured by the rhythm of etiquette. Yet those who saw her closely described a child unusually intelligent, full of warmth and wit. She adored music and painting, often watching Velázquez at work with silent fascination. Some said the artist doted on her, treating her as a child rather than a royal ornament. In his studio, she could smile freely, unburdened by protocol. It was here, before Velázquez's easel, that her humanity escaped for the last time. The painting that captured her at age 5 froze her in eternal sunlight, the moment before the storm. When the painter died soon after, his masterpiece remained in the palace, a relic of beauty preserved amid the rot of empire. Outside the palace walls, Spain was crumbling. The once mighty armadas lay rusting in their harbors. Famine and plague stalked the countryside. But inside the Alcazar, the Habsburgs clung to illusion. They held banquets in candlelit halls, drank from chalices engraved with family crests, and spoke of divine right while the world they ruled disintegrated. Among them, the tiny princess wandered like a ghost of future ruin. Her father, weary and aging, saw in her a final chance to secure the dynasty's power. His son and heir, the frail Prince Felipe Prospero, was sickly and weak. If the boy died, and most expected he would, only Margarita Teresa could preserve Spain's link to the Austrian Habsburgs. She was, from her cradle, destined for her uncle, Emperor Leopold I. The man who was her mother's brother would become her husband. Even as she learned to read and pray, her name was being whispered in negotiations between Madrid and Vienna. Court scholars wrote treatises defending the holiness of such a marriage, claiming that the blood of the saints must not mingle with the blood of sinners. The idea of inbreeding had become theology, a divine arithmetic used to justify monstrous unions. From the age of 8, she was examined by royal physicians who measured her bones, her height, her potential fertility. The records remain chilling in their detachment. They speak of development appropriate for her years, of skin pale but unmarred, of good hips for breeding. She was not even 10. Her mother, Queen Mariana, understood all too well what awaited her daughter. She herself had been 14 when she left Vienna to marry her uncle, Philip. The letters she sent home, still preserved in Austrian archives, reveal quiet desperation, loneliness, miscarriages, the weight of duty disguised as love. Now she watched her own child being prepared for the same fate, powerless to change a system that demanded obedience over compassion. Within the palace, Velázquez's painting remained a silent witness. Courtiers paraded past it daily, admiring the young infanta's beauty, unaware that they were admiring a prophecy, the image of a child doomed to repeat her mother's suffering. By the time Margarita Teresa turned 10, her life was no longer her own. Ministers debated her dowry as they might negotiate a treaty. Priests argued over whether a marriage to her uncle required special papal dispensation. Behind closed doors, the Spanish treasury, drained by endless wars, promised mountains of gold it did not possess just to secure the Austrian alliance. The young princess's value rose and fell with the empire's debts. In the rare hours when she was allowed solitude, she would walk in the palace gardens, attended by ladies-in-waiting who never strayed more than a few paces behind. Witnesses said she often stood before the fountains, staring into her reflection in the rippling water, silent, thoughtful as though glimpsing a truth too heavy for a child to bear. Outside, Spain's streets echoed with the chants of hungry peasants and the tolling bells of endless funerals. Inside, the court still performed its rituals of magnificence, masking decay with gold leaf and lace. The Habsburgs, convinced of their divine invincibility, could not see that their obsession with purity was the disease devouring them from within. As she approached 11, plans for her engagement to Emperor Leopold grew feverish. Every tutor, every lesson, every ceremony now revolved around preparing her for departure. She learned German phrases, court customs, and hymns sung in the imperial chapel of Vienna. Even her confessor reminded her that obedience to family and husband was obedience to God. Velázquez's masterpiece, the image of the bright, curious child, surrounded by the machinery of royal art, now took on a terrible irony. The light that once symbolized innocence had become the glow of a candle burning too fast. In that painting, she stands at the heart of her father's court, radiant, adored, and utterly imprisoned. Within a few years, she would be shipped across Europe to marry a man she called uncle. She would never see Spain again. Her golden childhood had lasted barely a decade. Beyond the palace walls, destiny waited with open jaws. It was the spring of 1663 when the Spanish court finally sealed its decision. The girl who once smiled for Velázquez's brush was now 11, barely a teenager, yet her fate had already been carved into marble. Across Europe, diplomats murmured her name in candlelit chambers. Margarita Teresa, the jewel of Spain, promised to Emperor Leopold I, her uncle. The negotiations had the precision of a business transaction. Ministers haggled over the dowry as though discussing the price of a warship. Vienna demanded territories, Madrid offered silver. Priests drafted papal dispensations to bless what both courts knew was unnatural. Her body, her very future, had become a ledger item in the empire's accounting of power. The Queen, Mariana of Austria, was silent. She had once been a bride of the same cruel system, sent across Europe at 14 to marry her uncle. Now she watched history repeat itself, the wheel of blood turning again, grinding another child beneath it. At night, in her private chapel, she prayed not for her daughter's happiness, but for her endurance. By the time the marriage contract was signed, Margarita Teresa was 12. The paper described her not as a girl, but as a vessel of virtue and fecundity. Her wedding would take place by proxy, as royal custom demanded. In Madrid, under the vaulted ceiling of the palace chapel, she stood pale and trembling beside a tall Austrian ambassador who represented the groom. When the priest asked if she accepted the emperor as her husband, she whispered, "Yes," her voice barely audible over the ringing of the choir. It was April 25th, 1666. From that moment, she ceased to be a Spanish princess. She was now Empress of the Holy Roman Empire in name, at least. Her childhood was over. The preparations for her departure began at once. The royal wardrobe filled with gifts, gowns of gold and crimson velvet, pearls sewn into her headdress, a miniature portrait of her father to wear near her heart. But nothing could disguise the truth. The journey she was about to undertake was not a celebration but an exile. When her carriage left Madrid, the streets were lined with silent crowds. They cheered, but their faces betrayed unease. Everyone knew she was being sent to a foreign land to marry her uncle, a man twice her age. The journey across Europe took months. From the sun-baked plains of Castile to the snow-laden passes of the Alps, her entourage moved like a moving court of ghosts, priests, maids, soldiers, ambassadors. At every city, fireworks and fanfares greeted her, though she smiled less with each passing stop. By the time she reached Vienna in December 1666, the world outside was frozen under thick snow. Inside the city's palaces, however, warmth and celebration overflowed. The Austrian Habsburgs had spared no expense. Candles blazed in every window, choirs sang in Latin, and the people whispered of divine blessing. Spain and Austria reunited at last. But inside her private chambers, the 14-year-old bride sat motionless. The walls were unfamiliar. The language around her sounded harsh and foreign. Even her ladies-in-waiting seemed distant, loyal more to the empire than to her. That night, while fireworks thundered outside, she wrote a letter to her mother in Madrid. Only fragments survive. I am here now. They are kind, but I am so very far from home. The official wedding took place a week later at St. Stephen's Cathedral. She walked up the aisle in a gown of silver brocade that shimmered under candlelight. Leopold, her uncle and husband, waited at the altar. He was 26, courteous, devout, and gentle in manner, yet his face bore the unmistakable mark of his lineage. The long Habsburg jaw, the heavy lower lip, the melancholy eyes of a man raised for duty, not love. Witnesses said he looked almost fatherly beside her, his hand trembling as he placed the ring on her finger. She looked like a doll carved of porcelain, fragile, silent, and much too young to understand the vows she repeated. When the ceremony ended, the church bells of Vienna rang for hours. The crowd roared with joy, yet behind the palace doors, the reality of marriage began with brutal swiftness. She was an empress now, and the empire expected results. The Austrian court was cold, rigid, and suspicious of the Spanish retinue that surrounded her. Her attendants spoke a different dialect. Her customs were mocked as foreign. The women of Vienna whispered that the child bride was a curiosity, a relic of Spain's decaying empire, brought here to bear heirs for Austria's glory. Doctors began examining her almost immediately. Their task was to ensure that her young body was mature enough for conception. Every report they wrote treated her not as a person but as a vessel. The emperor's confessor reassured him that God would bless their union, that, in holy bloodlines, even the forbidden is sanctified. By February 1667, courtiers whispered the news they had all been waiting for. The empress was pregnant. The empire rejoiced. But the young girl wept in silence. At 15, her body struggled under the strain. The pregnancy was hard, filled with fever and weakness. Palace physicians bled her, fed her powders made from crushed pearls and mercury, and confined her to her chambers. Every morning, she prayed before the Virgin Mary's statue, her hands trembling. Servants noted her thinness, her pale lips, the way she would clutch her stomach after every meal. After 7 months, she miscarried. The child was gone before it could breathe. The court's joy turned to irritation, not pity. Within weeks, they began pressing her to conceive again. The Empress is young, one doctor wrote coldly. Her body will adapt. She did conceive again, but that too ended in stillbirth. The cycle repeated: hope, pregnancy, loss, until grief became part of her daily routine. The palace ladies whispered that she was too delicate, that her Spanish constitution was weak. Yet to the ministers of Vienna and Madrid, her failures were statistical disappointments, not tragedies. Amid this agony, Emperor Leopold seemed the only one who saw her suffering. He was pious, awkward, and timid, a man of books and prayer rather than cruelty. In his private writings, he called her mein Engelchen, my little angel. He stayed by her side through fevers and tears, playing the harpsichord softly in her chambers to calm her. But even his tenderness could not undo the machine of empire grinding around them both. The pressure to produce an heir never ceased. The Spanish ambassadors sent letters demanding results. The alliance depends on her womb, one wrote bluntly. Leopold, torn between affection and duty, gave in to the demands of his ministers. In early 1669, Margarita conceived again. This time, she survived the pregnancy. In January 1670, she gave birth to a daughter, Archduchess Maria Antonia. The bells of Vienna rang once more, and courtiers proclaimed the union blessed. But behind the smiling portraits, the young empress lay frail and shivering, unable to stand. Her child lived a small, fragile girl with pale skin and the unmistakable Habsburg features, but the price had been devastating. Margarita Theresa's body was collapsing. Doctors ordered her to rest, yet the whispers began again. She must try for a son. In her letters home, she pleaded for release. "Mother," she wrote, "I have fulfilled what they wished. I am so tired. I wish I could see the sun in Madrid once more." But Spain needed her marriage too much to listen. At the grand feasts of Vienna, she sat beside her husband, smiling faintly while courtiers toasted to the glory of Habsburg blood. None saw that beneath her jeweled gown her hands trembled from exhaustion, that she sometimes fainted in mid-conversation, that the bloom of her youth had already faded. The empire had turned her into a symbol of triumph, the uniting of two crowns, but behind the facade, she was a prisoner in velvet. In those cold marble halls, the once radiant child of Las Meninas now moved like a ghost of her former self. The painting that immortalized her as a girl of sunlight and promise now hung thousands of miles away in Madrid, while its subject sat dying under candlelight in Vienna. Her eyes, once so full of life, had learned the stillness of porcelain. She was 18, and already an old woman. By the time the year 1671 arrived, Empress Margarita Theresa was little more than a shadow in silk. Her once golden hair had thinned, her skin grown pallid beneath layers of powder, and her smile, that luminous glow Velázquez had captured, had become a faint, ghostly flicker. Yet around her, the Austrian court continued its ritual of denial. The dinners, the operas, the religious pageants all continued, as if the empress's decline were merely a passing illness, not the slow unraveling of a human life. Vienna's corridors were perfumed with incense and ambition. Courtiers whispered in the same breath about God's will and dynastic necessity. Doctors came and went, their hands cold with instruments and superstition. Each one insisted that rest was weakness, that new life would restore her, and so the cycle continued. After the birth of her daughter, Maria Antonia, Leopold's advisors pressed him again. "A daughter cannot secure the line," they said. "God demands a son." And so, against her own failing strength, Margarita Theresa was expected to try again. The palace chaplain told her that bearing another child was her holy duty, to ensure the survival of Christendom itself. The young empress obeyed. She always obeyed. That winter, she conceived once more. But the pregnancy was agony from the beginning days of fever, nights of bleeding. Her body, barely recovered from years of pregnancies and miscarriages, was collapsing under the strain. Court physicians prescribed leeches, tonics of crushed coral and vinegar, and strange herbal draughts meant to purify her blood. Every treatment made her weaker. Leopold, tormented by guilt, tried to comfort her. He ordered string musicians to play softly outside her chamber doors, praying that music might bring her peace, but the sound only deepened her sorrow. She would whisper to her attendants, "They sing for a funeral, not a birth." By mid-1671, the miscarriages returned. Another tiny body, lifeless and pale, was carried away before dawn. Her fourth pregnancy had ended like the others, in silence, in failure, in blood. The court chroniclers recorded it, as they always did, in cold ink. "The empress has been delivered of a stillborn child. Her health remains delicate." After that, something in her spirit broke. She stopped writing letters home. Her Spanish attendants found her sitting for hours before a window overlooking the palace gardens, staring at the frozen trees as if searching for Madrid beyond the horizon. "She is fading," one of them whispered, "like a candle that burns without air." But the machinery of empire did not stop for grief. In early 1672, she was forced into another pregnancy, her fifth. This time, even the doctors hesitated. Her pulse was faint, her skin grey, but ministers reminded them that Spain's succession crisis was worsening. King Charles II, Margarita Theresa's half-brother, was frail and heirless. If she bore a son, he could inherit both thrones. Her womb had become Europe's last hope. The pregnancy dragged through that terrible year. She was too weak to leave her bed. Food turned to ash in her mouth, the prayers of her confessors blurred into distant noise. Her hair fell out in clumps. The palace smelled faintly of sickness and candle wax. Leopold visited her often, guilt carving lines into his gentle face. He prayed beside her bed, holding the same hand that had once been so lively and small. But even he could not stop the tide that had already been set in motion by generations before them. By March of 1673, her body could endure no more. On the 12th day of that month, She went into labor 3 months too early. The palace filled with frantic voices, midwives rushing, priests preparing for the last rites, courtiers crowding the hallways. For hours, the screams of the Empress echoed through the marble corridors of Vienna's Hofburg Palace. When silence finally fell, both mother and child were dead. She was 21 years old. The chroniclers wrote their usual line, "Her Imperial Majesty passed peacefully into the Lord's embrace." But the truth was far more brutal. Witnesses spoke of blood pooling on the cold stone floor, of a child never meant to live, of a young woman whose last words were not prayers but the name of her mother. Leopold locked himself in his private chapel for days. They said he wept until his face swelled, that he refused to eat or speak. But when he emerged, duty reclaimed him. The Empire demanded another marriage, another attempt to secure the line. Before the Empress's body was even cold, letters were sent across Europe in search of a new bride. Her funeral was magnificent, thousands of candles, choirs in black velvet, and a golden coffin draped in crimson cloth embroidered with the imperial crest. But it was not love they honored. It was appearance, power, continuity. The same forces that had destroyed her now used her death as proof of divine sacrifice. The people of Vienna whispered that the Empress had been a saint, a martyr of bloodline and faith. But no saint had ever suffered for such a hollow god. From Madrid, word of her death reached her mother weeks later. Queen Mariana read the letter alone and fainted. The court chroniclers recorded her grief only as an inconvenience that delayed a council meeting. Spain, already crumbling under debts and illness, had no time to mourn its lost daughter. The empire marched on, but its heart had begun to rot. The genetic curse that killed Margarita Teresa would soon claim the rest of her family. Her only surviving child, Maria Antonia, inherited the same fragile blood and died young after her own series of stillbirths. Her half-brother, Charles II of Spain, was so deformed and feeble that he could barely chew or speak. When he died childless in 1700, the Habsburg dynasty in Spain died with him. The war that followed the War of the Spanish Succession tore Europe apart. Armies marched, empires collapsed, and the Habsburgs lost the very world they had sacrificed their children to preserve. Margarita Teresa had become, in death, what she had been in life, a symbol of beauty masking ruin. Centuries later, her image still hangs in Madrid, that same golden-haired child staring from Velázquez's Las Meninas. Viewers see a masterpiece of light and illusion. Few remember the real story behind it, that the child gazing at us was condemned long before she could understand why. Art historians speak of the painting's technical genius, its mirrors, its perspective, its mysterious composition. But what they seldom mention is the emotion that lingers in her eyes, the soft confusion of someone too young to know that the world around her is a cage. That gaze crosses centuries. It pierces the museum air like a whisper. She is still watching us, the girl who was born to be sold, married to her uncle, and buried as a symbol of divine order. Her silence accuses the living. For all their crowns and their castles, the Habsburgs could not escape the one truth that her short life revealed. Power built on purity will always consume itself. Margarita Teresa's name is now spoken only in footnotes, her life overshadowed by the splendor of a painting. Yet that is her final revenge, for while the dynasty that enslaved her crumbled into dust, her image remains radiant, untouched by time. In that frozen moment of Velázquez's brush, she is no longer a victim but a witness, a child staring back at history itself, luminous, eternal, and unforgettably human.